Pursuit of Motion episode 4. We made it. Welcome to today's episode. Before we start, I'd like to thank today's sponsor. This video brought to you in part by my music. Take a listen to my catalog and hopefully you enjoy that. This conversation was had on April 30th of 2024 with Dr. Igor Shoikhedbrod, a professor at St. FX. It was a great pleasure speaking with Dr. Shoikhedbrod. I'm very blessed to have had a conversation with somebody who has knowledge in the realms that he does. And to any of you who go to school at X or plan on coming, it might not be a bad idea to keep your eye out, see if you have the opportunity to take some classes with him. I believe that the study of philosophy and political science and political theory is incredibly important. So we spoke about different philosophical topics such as social contract theory, which basically explains what it is that holds together our democratic society, the thought that historically went into it, into progressing into where we're at today. And we also speak about the importance of an education and getting smarter. And I really hope you enjoy today's episode. The song of the day, now I'll preface it, this is no way affiliated with Dr. Shoikhedbrod and his music taste. STFU by Chris Webby with Mercules and Lil Windex. You'll see that the picture is here on the screen. Great song. Add that to the song of the day list. Without further ado, enjoy the conversation.
Yep. So you have it like this, or
It's a no knees.
it's over one?
Yeah, packed my dress shoes up before thinking about that I would need them.
Plus, we don't want to be too far removed from the people.
100%. Well, and it's part of the look is the suit for the show, at least first season, most of it.
Okay, no, I leave that. I leave the choreography to you.
Yeah, the optics, right?
The optics. That's right.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of Pursuit of Motion. We're here today with Dr. Igor Shoikhedbrod. We've had 2 classes together, but the class that we took this year was Modern Political Thought. And I will say, being able to dive into thinkers, of course, it's a pretty high level, considering it's my first read, but this is life-changing. If you get a chance to read the philosophers of, we'll say, the 1500s through the 1800s, maybe 1900s, something about that literature really engrossed me. Today's episode was a serious battle to get to. We had all sorts of equipment malfunction, but thank you for being here. I'm glad that we are started. And I'd like to know, Dr. S., what sparked your interest in political science?
Well, first and foremost, Adnan, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to have this conversation. I suppose, this kind of brings me back to my undergraduate years and thinking about what got me interested in philosophy more general. I don't know about yourself, but in my case, I was, really interested in those abstract questions. Philosophy is more or less informed by this love of wisdom. And there are broader questions, right, concerning the good life, right? What is the good life? Concerning ethics, which is a branch of philosophy, much like epistemology is a branch of philosophy. And I was kind of struggling with answers to those questions. And in many respects, I was excited about the undergraduate journey, Introduction to Philosophy or Introductory Philosophy at the University of Toronto, where you get exposed in kind of very broad brushstrokes to these deeper questions, meaning, right, questions about justice and so on and so forth. And some of those questions are more or less abstract, but I was more interested in the practically oriented questions, in what's called political philosophy, right, which is a branch of philosophy, much like ethics, metaphysics, epistemology, right? Precisely because it's more applied, precisely because some of the more abstract questions, what is justice, right? What is the most freedom-enabling regime? We, political philosophers, political theorists, historians of political thought, are kind of compelled to think practically about everyday life, right? When we think about what justice is or what justice entails, for example. So I would say that that's what got me interested in political philosophy, political theory more generally. But it began with kind of curiosity about those deeper questions. Many undergraduates think of them as questions of meaning. What is the meaning of life? Right? What is justice? Is there a sense of purpose? And I think that's really what pushed me in this particular direction. And I found that political philosophy was the most applied of these branches of philosophy. And that's why I got into political science, which Aristotle, of course, at one point or another referred to as the master of science.
The master science. I agree with
We,
that.
we like to think that in particular. Maybe it's a conceit on our part, right? The economists and the psychologists and the natural science in particular would say.
Yeah, there's certainly, I think that's one of the great things about being on a campus that has so many varied, pursuits, is that you get to have conversations with different people. And
Mhm.
all of my friends do not like political science.
Yeah,
But I tell them it's like strategic history. Once you know history and once you understand how to apply these schools of thought, it sort of makes life interesting. It illuminates different strategies and the way people think. So I would agree with you there. And so, did you know you wanted to take your PhD like through your undergrad, or was this something? How did you sort of get to where you are today?
no, I wouldn't say it was exactly my calling, quote unquote, to use Max Weber's terminology, from the get go. Instead, I think it was a series of circumstances that led me there, where I kind of moved from the more abstract questions to the more concrete and kind of practical questions. I should say that my undergraduate major was in an interdisciplinary program called Ethics, Society, and Law. And there are a few of these programs in Canada and North America more generally. But to be perfectly blunt and frank about it, it's because I struggled when it came to, figuring out what I'd like to major, right? Because I enjoyed philosophy. I was interested in sociology, in economic history, economic theory, for example, but also in politics as well. And that's what got me interested in ethics, society, and law. Then I realized that I'm mostly interested in the practical questions and the problems, right, that are studied in political science, of which, political philosophy, political theory, if you will, is a subfield. So I think it wasn't sort of a process that kind of began there. Rather, it was the conclusion that I reached after kind of figuring out what I'm really interested in. And I found that the concreteness, if you will, or the practical orientation of political science within the social sciences more broadly is, something that I wanted to pursue in greater depth.
And so, how did that pursuit bring you to Saint FX? And would you say X has affected your research in any way?
Yeah, well, as you'll probably find with most academics, especially junior scholars, there is a long prehistory, right? When you complete your PhD, oftentimes what happens is you pursue a postdoc. In my case, I pursued two postdocs. And then I worked for many years, many is relative, I should say, for about 5 years or so, as a sessional contract faculty member. And I guess the most recent experience was at Dalhousie University, where I was based in the political science department, mostly working, teaching courses in political theory, but for the most part within this concentration program called Law, Justice, and Society, which again is similar to the Ethics, Society, and Law program, where I began at Trinity College in the University of Toronto. And so from there, there was an opening, a search for political theorists, St. FX, more specifically in the political science department. And I was really happy to apply for that position because this is, in many respects, my chief interest: political theory, history of political thought, the interplay between law and politics, and legal philosophy or legal theory. And so I applied and heard a lot of positive things about St. FX, and in particular, yes, and in particular, the faculty-student ratio, the small class sizes. In fact, I enjoy that the most because, and I think this is something that we should protect at all costs because it really improves the student experience. But not only the student experience, believe it or not, also the instructor's experience of being able to interact, to have that kind of back and forth, right? The Socratic approach, if you will. That you're not simply being lectured at, or the instructor is lecturing at you, but that students get a chance to pose questions, and the instructor challenges students to think about those questions. And the point isn't to arrive at ready-made answers, but to think through problems, right? To inquire. I think that's really important. So that's sort of what brought me to Saint FX, and that's how I was been able to harness some of that prior experience in order to try to really get students interested in the history of political thought, in political theory. But to use an Aristotelian notion, I'll let the students judge for themselves whether or not that has been a positive experience. So you're welcome to judge at another point in time.
Using this time, I will say the small classroom sizes. I have a lot of friends that went to university, and none of them talk about their respective, institutions in the same way that I hear people at St. FX. And I personally am a diehard. I can't wait to have the ring. And so, yeah, I would say that allows for discourse, having a smaller classroom. And so you talk about all these different fields of political science and theory.
Mhm.
And I think that you could argue that social contract theory really covers a lot of that. So, what is social contract theory, and who are the key thinkers behind the concept, and how would you say it's relevant?
Right. Okay. So perhaps we'll start with the key representatives, thinkers of the social contract tradition. Sometimes they're referred to as contractarians, right? And so some of the thinkers I have in mind, and most of the time political theorists and historians of political thought have in mind, are Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and Immanuel Kant. I'll start there, and then also point out the subsequent reverberations in contract theorists, some of whom were deeply influenced by these thinkers in the 20th century and beyond. So one can think of John Rawls, his famous theory of justice, continues to be very influential as being deeply influenced by the social tradition. That would be one example of a thinker who's deeply influenced by the social contract tradition, more or less tries to update it to make sense of what justice is, right? At least when he was writing in the 20th century. And Rawls is considered one of the most influential, some would argue the greatest. There's a big debate about that, as you can imagine, political philosopher of the 20th century and beyond. But what is the social contract tradition? Well, we have to ask ourselves, what is a social contract, right? The first thing to note is that contracts aren't usually arrived at or pursued among friends, right? Or family members. I mean, they are and they're not, right? Because the basic understanding is that it's some kind of a formal arrangement. And usually you enter into these arrangements with people who aren't your friends, people who you wouldn't otherwise trust. And the nature of the relationship is impersonal. It's not someone you really care about. It's precisely because you don't care about them, right? That you're kind of worried about them living up to those contractual arrangements. Now, usually now, in legal theory, in private law, we think that contracts are made between private parties. We don't tend to think about contracts in terms of the relationship between the state or a quasi-state and its citizens. Usually we think about, contracts or agreements between persons as matters of transactional justice, right? You have a particular interest or need that needs satisfaction, and then this other party to the contract is able to supply. And you arrive at a contract, and usually the currency is money. We can talk about that a bit later. But in this particular case, the social contract tradition concerns the relationship between, you could say, a government or a state-like entity and its citizens. And in many respects, it is a deeply, one could say, Western conception. The idea is that the government or the state-like, quasi-state-like entity owes something to the individuals over which it has rule or governs. And at the same time, the individuals in question also have certain duties to the government. And the basic kind of unifying theme is consent. Slaves, people cannot be forced into contracts, although there are some contracts where the options, and especially the exit options, are incredibly limited. We can go into that a bit later. But the basic idea is that you have to be a free being, you have to be a legal person in order to enter into contracts to begin. And so, in the liberal democratic tradition of political thought, the social contract tradition is central in large part because any contract rests upon the consent of the individuals entering it. But what's key, and I'll try to be concise here, is that in all the thinkers that I've described, really briefly in passing, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and Immanuel Kant, the nature of the contractual arrangement differs. So you need to look at the fine print, so to speak, especially if you compare someone like Hobbes to someone like Rousseau, what the contract is made up of, and the terms of those contractual arrangements differ. The reason why I say consent is so important because consent is also the basis for legitimacy. It's what makes that particular contractual arrangement legitimate in the sense that those who enter it consent to it. And therefore the government that is formed as a consequence of this contract, and this social contract between the state or the government, and the citizens, right, of the members of the political community rests upon the consent of force. And that is applicable to all the thinkers that I mentioned, from Hobbes to Kant. And so the key then is that the ruling regime, if you will, the government is legitimate because it has the consent of the government. And of course, as you can imagine, that becomes a guiding thread in liberal democratic theory, and more importantly, in liberal democratic practice. Think about the American Revolution, think about the Founding Fathers. Some would argue that this notion of taxation and representation, the idea is, the background idea is that of the social contract. What does the government owe to the individuals who have consented to its rule? If we can put it in those terms. That's a guiding thread in all these thinkers, but it must be said that the terms of the contract differ across these thinkers. The consent, legitimacy, and a contract between members of the political community and the government.
So social contract theory is really sort of the relationship between the people and the state which they put into place through consent.
Yes.
And ultimately it's, the representation of the people through a Leviathan, to use Igor's term. And so how would this social contract influence our system today, would you say?
Okay, well, the first thing to note that should be added is that there is a transition in all of these thinkers, thinkers or contractarians, from what's called the state of nature, which is a pre-political, not necessarily a pre-social state, because individuals may still interact outside the framework of a state. And so all these contract theorists want to justify a particular political association, particular form of the state that they think is wanting in what they call the state of nature, which is usually a lawless state. As Hobbes would say, in the absence of a common authority to keep men in awe, there ensues a war of all against all. What they want to do, each in their own different ways, is to move from this lawless state or lawless context to a situation where there isn't arbitrariness, where political authority is deemed legitimate, precisely because it rests on the consent of the government. Now, to answer your question, this is kind of the infrastructure that informs the answer to your questions. How is this relevant today? Well, we still tend to think in liberal democratic societies that our elected representatives have a certain obligation or a duty to represent their constituents, right? And the basis for that assumption or presupposition is that we have consented to the rule provided that they represent us. They represent our preferences, our interests as constituents, because we've effectively given them that power. And that power is not unlimited. There are a series of what's called checks and balances, and that's informed partly by the doctrine of the separation of powers, and also term limits, which are very important that basically remind us and remind those in power that they are subservient ultimately to us because we've consented. And in some thinkers, as we've discussed in the course on modern political thought, like John Locke in particular, there may be circumstances in which a ruling government or regime, undermines that notion of the social contract, and in that sense becomes a rebel itself. And against such a regime, Locke argues that people have a right to rebel against the regime, right? Which, of course, is a complicated matter, leads to a lot of political instability. But at the end of the day, if the regime in question becomes arbitrary, it means that it has undermined its part of the social. And of course, the right to rebellion or revolution isn't something that's endorsed by all the social contract theorists. And even in Locke, it's very circumscribed. But here is an example of a situation where the elected representatives, again, we have to keep in mind that the suffrage hadn't been won, right? So a lot of the time what we do is we read back aspects of our own society into the past. But the basic idea here is that consent and political legitimacy as resting on consent still continues to inform how we understand legitimate government and republican countries.
But see, that makes me wonder now, what did the world look like pre-social contract theory? So when we discuss, ancient versus modern philosophical thought, how would you say those two, cleave, and how would you say they are separate?
I think the most straightforward way of answering this question is by focusing on the units of analysis. This is a prime unit of analysis in the ancient world. And of course, we're thinking about thinkers like Aristotle, Aristotle's politics, thinking about Plato's Republic, Plato's laws. And at least in our course, we talked about Benjamin Constant and his famous speech, if you will, or essay, concerning the differences between the liberty of the ancients and the liberty of the moderns. And why do I say the basic unit of analysis? Who gets prime attention, in other words, in the ancient world? It's not the solitary atomistic individual and the big rights. It's rather the fully immersed member of the political community, the citizen, right, in the ancient world. And in that sense, if you ask someone like Aristotle, we're talking about the politics, do you consent to the political regime of which you are a part? You would think that that's a kind of a foreign terminology because we are not self-sufficient as individuals. We depend on the thriving, or the opposite of that, of the political community of which we are a part. And so in Aristotle's account, although this is much debated, right, the political community as a whole comes before the individual part. So to refer to the individual's right against the political community, to refer to the individual's consent, to claim that the individual matters the way we like to claim in contemporary politics is sort of foreign to that conception of the good life, right, in the ancient world. In the modern world in particular, since you posed that question, the individual becomes the epicenter of our analyses and in connection to the just state, right, or the legitimate political association. So it's as if the notion of the citizen, although still important, occupies a secondary role to that of the separate individual, the bearer of rights, who wants to be left alone by the political community of which they are still a part. So I think, that thick sense of citizenship, in many respects, gets relaxed, and some would argue undermined, in the context of the modern world. And we're talking about the Western world here for the time being, because there are different modernities. They're not limited to the Western world, I should add. And so, this focal point on the human rights of the individual, something new and modern in Western political thought, and the attention that it gets in the modern day, and the importance and centrality of consent would have been quite foreign to the ancient world for the reasons that I've mentioned, really briefly, trying to make this as accessible and as straightforward as possible.
So really the big difference between the ancient world and the modern world is there used to be a more collectivist society where you got told your position and it stayed that way more or less. It was based around religion. It was based around hierarchy. Whereas nowadays, the individual is their own master, I guess, in society. And so in pursuit of our own personal interests, profit and, property, we are private property. Yeah, we're sort of exercising the same duty as a citizen that in the past would have been voting or discourse, or at least for the upper class citizen.
Yeah, I suppose that's one way of looking at it, but it's important to understand that this is something that the German philosopher, the mighty thinker Joseph Hegel, would refer to ethical life, right? The series kind of normative horizons that inform our ways of thinking, the things that become second nature to us as a consequence of living in a particular political community, right? And so, in a way, we have to be careful because there's always this value judgment that, well, the ancients, their ethical lives were informed by hierarchy, exclusion, which they were, no doubt, especially with the ancient Greeks. And that's not something that we should celebrate. But at the same time, we have to understand and grapple with the reality that for them it made sense, that this wasn't something that was imposed upon them, this something that they thought was natural. And they had reasons to believe that it was natural, right? Here's one example in Aristotle. Aristotle talks about exchange. And he talks about natural exchange and unnatural exchange. A natural exchange is where you need something, right? Your need satisfaction is there. And someone else has the commodity, let's call it that. That will satisfy your need. That's the commodity you need. And that's a perfectly natural exchange. You need shoes. Someone who's the cobbler, there's someone selling those shoes, and you use the currency of money in order to exchange. And then that way, supply and demand all this need. And an unnatural exchange is that you decide that to enter that exchange not for the sake of getting the need satisfaction, but to make money. And you pursue that for its own sake, not for the satisfaction of your needs as a human individual. Aristotle refers to that form of exchange as unnatural and as pleonexia, as pathological, as sickness. Because for his conception of ethical life, it's not natural to want to make money for the sake of making money, you see? So for him, it was unnatural. For us, it's perfectly natural. So we have to be sensitive to the kind of different contexts that inform ethical life in ancient and modern societies. And even here, we're generalizing because there are different regime types in ancient, kind of the ancient Greek world. Sparta, Athens, and all driven or characterized by different conceptions of that. So there is a yearning sometimes among political theorists to simplify things and to generalize across the board, ancients, moderns. Those are ideal types that we use to help us navigate the complex differences between these worlds. They're not always perfect. They can't capture all the completeness of those worlds.
So we've spoken about thought and reason a lot in that little question. And so that perfectly leads on to the next question. What is reason and what is perfectibility? What would you say the reason means within the context of philosophical conversation?
The most accessible way of answering that question is by thinking about reason as the kind of hardware, the faculty of reason that all of us possess. And then there's the question of whether or not we are ready to exercise it. So there's a lot to be said there. Kant talks about man's emergence from self-incurred maturity. But even if you have this faculty of reason, think of it in terms of hardware, you may not be prepared to use it for a host of different reasons. You may actively be prevented from doing so by the regime in power, or you would rather someone else do the exercising of the faculty of reason for you, right? Because, it's easier that way. So it could be a form of paternalism, right, that's actually inspired by the individual who doesn't want to think for themselves. But let's start with the presupposition that it's the hardware that all of us basically possess, that this hardware distinguishes us from non-human animals, in the sense that we are above the other non-human animals, still kind of a major assumption of Western philosophy, also in terms of distinction between subject and object, which I won't get into right now. And then the claim is, suppose all of us have the courage to make use of this personal faculty. Well, then that's intricately tied to our ability to liberate ourselves from various manifestations or expressions of superstition, irrational tendencies, if you will. And that speaks to our perfectibility, that we can really be great creatures, right? If we find the courage to make use of this hardware. Some of us will, some of us will not, perhaps. And there may be different reasons for why that is the case. But if we think about Enlightenment philosophers, for them, it was really critical for this faculty, which is universal to human beings, for it to become front and center, right? Because that would inform growth, not only in knowledge, but the application of that knowledge in the real world for the purposes of human liberation and emancipation. And that would also contribute to developments in technology. So there are many Enlightenment-inspired thinkers. I mentioned Kant. I think of Condorcet, who has a sketch of different stages, right, to which humanity passes in this process of perfectibility, improving our situation by making use of this faculty of reason, this hardware, which is immanent to us, inherent to us, part of our constitution, which then leads to profound changes in the real world and on the ground. You see? So perfectibility is something that's latent, and if we exercise this faculty of reason, it could really allow us to realize our fullest potential. Perfectibility is latent, but we have to exercise this faculty of reason in order for us to really become. It's a process. It's not something that's given and ready-made.
So reason is what sets us apart from animals and other creatures. Man is a political animal. Aristotle, man is a political.
Yes.
And so
By nature.
and so our ability to critical think and to make decisions and to delay gratification allows us to build and progress and pursue motion. That's the name of the podcast. Pursuit of motion. Yes. And so perfectibility is sort of the concept that there's a maximum potential that you can reach,
Mhm.
and that by working very hard and diligently in the right direction, you can reach that perfectibility.
Mhm.
But there are, philosophers, especially, Rousseau, that we had read discourses on the origin of inequality, that would say that perfectibility is actually man's biggest downfall.
Mm.
It's that by stressing about what you could get done, you aren't, from my understanding, by stressing about what you could get done, you're not living as you are, and you're comparing yourself to everyone, and comparison is the thief of joy. So would you say that perfectibility is humanity's greatest strength, or that it is actually a weakness?
Mhm. Well, that's a very complicated question, as you can appreciate.
Yeah, of course.
But I do want to kind of bring the nuance to the attention of your viewers and your listeners. So, in Rousseau, we read two words: Discourse on the Origin of Inequality and also the Social Contract. And the place of perfectibility and whether or not, it's something that's positive or negative values across those two works, arguably, because, of course, there's a debate among historians of political thought about whether or not there is a tension between these two works by Rousseau. So there is, of course, not much of a debate that in the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, Rousseau is critical of perfectibility, this latent tendency in the human being to try to improve their lot, their circumstances. And then remember, there's this catastrophic event of some kind that brings us together. But the reason why Rousseau is so critical of perfectibility is because he thinks it's a deviation from the pristine state of authenticity, namely of perfect self-sufficiency, which he characterizes, or at least that's how he characterized the state of nature in the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. So even in that particular work, the reason why perfectibility is part of our undoing is because it takes us away from a more authentic state of perfect freedom in the sense of self-sufficiency, right? We think of his distinction using the French words mot de soi, right, self, and a mot propre, which relies on this interpersonal comparison. So even in Rousseau, the answer to that question isn't always so clear, because when it comes to the social contract, in many respects, it is an enlightenment. Well, it ended up inspiring the French revolutionaries, some of the case. But the idea there is maybe perfectibility can still redeem us, notwithstanding the fact that it leads to interpersonal comparison, vanity, and conflict between individuals, and not to mention great inequality and anti-social tendencies among human beings. So I don't think there's a straightforward answer to whether or not perfectibility is a good or a bad. It really depends which tendencies become dominant. So, for example, think of technology. Technological developments in and of themselves are value neutral. Think about the development of medicine. Isn't that used in many respects to help human beings? Think about the development of nuclear weapons. Doesn't that bring with it the potential of the destruction of the human species? So technology in and of itself, which is part and parcel, you could say, of perfectibility, given that it allows us to reach our fullest potential, if you will, it's a double-edged sword at all times. Something, if I can borrow from the legal philosopher Joseph Raz, he uses the example of a knife, talking about the rule of law, which I won't get into right now. But think about it, a knife could be used to cut steak. I apologize in advance to the vegans. But it could also be used to hurt someone. And so I think perfectibility is like that. If a certain facet of perfectibility, and people refer to this as instrumental rationality, means and reasoning, is used to reduce human beings to objects and to things, then it can be potentially catastrophic, right? Because human beings are not things, and they shouldn't be reduced to the status of things, because they have dignity. Precisely because they have this rational faculty, they should be treated differently. But the same technology, if you will, can be used to liberate human beings, to educate human beings, to encourage human beings to think for themselves. So I don't think there's a ready-made answer to that question. But some thinkers like Horkheimer and Adorno, the first generation of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theorists, they will this word dialectic of enlightenment, where basically the forces that were meant to liberate human beings also subjugated them, led to the Holocaust, led to Stalinism in the Soviet Union. So one thing I think that's certain is there's no guarantee of success. That perfectibility will be used by the good angels of our nature. But the potential is there for it to be used precisely with that intent.
So perfectibility is almost like a concept that not only is it almost unattainable as a person, but it's something that can be attained to the darkest of results. You can aim your pursuits in the wrong direction and achieve that goal, but to what end? So I did talk about now a historical perspective. We're talking about reason and about thought and about inequality. So could you discuss the relevance of the French Revolution in our modern context?
Enlightenment philosophy found its culmination in the French Revolution. So, philosophy, when we think about philosophy, we tend to think about abstract ideas that don't always coincide with practical developments on the ground. Well, here is an instance where the link between theory and practice was just undeniable, because Enlightenment philosophy had inspired many arguers, especially the Enlightenment philosophers. I'm pronouncing it so that it can be heard in the plural. It's not the correct pronunciation in the French. The French Revolution effectively made that philosophy real. So it wasn't like you had philosophy on one side up in the sky, and then the Revolution on the ground. There was no connection between them. Because the French Revolution was guided by Enlightenment ideals of freedom, equality, liberté, égalité, fraternité, which found its inspiration in Enlightenment philosophy. Okay, now your question pertained to the contemporary relevance. So, of course, there are many critics of the French Revolution, right? Sometimes cast as the romantic conservative reaction to the French Revolution for its horizonless, groundless kind of view of the world. And much of that stems from this uneasiness about the French Revolution's radical break with the past. So that, again, brings to mind the distinction between ancients and moderns. The idea that human beings are fundamentally free and equal is, in many respects, the product of the French Revolution. That we are deserving of inalienable rights is also a product of the Revolution, which was a radical break with the past. Of course, there's also a parallel here with the American Revolution, which inspired it, as well as the Haitian slave revolution, which is often placed under the rug, right? Because it's an extension of Enlightenment philosophical principles that not all Enlightenment philosophers, or for that matter, all European revolutionaries, wanted to extend globally. Because again, it forces us to confront the question of what does the human individual deserve? Well, the answer to that question, inalienable rights, precisely because of the history of oppression, primarily by unelected, accountable leaders, absolute monarchs, right, and despots, who precisely because of the absence of the rights of man, were able to reduce human beings to the status of things, and worse, and oppress them as if they were things. So the question then becomes, what's the relevance today? Well, the relevance is that we take for granted, at least in liberal democratic societies, that human beings have dignity, that they should be afforded rights against the state and against each other. And many of the things that we take for granted are the products of this radical break with the past, which was inaugurated by the French Revolution. Now, of course, we're also seeing developments which despise the historical achievements of the French Revolution. We want to go back to a context where there is natural hierarchy between individuals, and that the past was better than the present, and that the French Revolution was a great disaster precisely because it wanted to achieve at least formal equality between individuals. So we're seeing developments around the world that, would like to challenge and question the achievements of the French Revolution, the American Revolution, which are predicated with all the contradictions. Think about slavery in the United States, and speaking at the same time about freedom and equality in the abstract. Nonetheless, there are attempts as well to kind of turn back the clock and to return to a situation where the human individual isn't regarded as free and equal, right? But rather naturally unequal, and that some are superior to others. And that, of course, is very troubling for those individuals who are committed to the essentials of these issues.
Would you say that the French Revolution was like the birthplace of our modern understanding and conception of democracy?
Well, the modern conception, that's a loaded question in many respects, if I may add. Usually, we say that it's Athens, democratic Athens, ancient Athens, is the birthplace of democracy, not modern democracy, because modern democracy is represented. But you're quite right to say that at least this notion of the republic is in many respects the French Revolution, in the sense that what is a republic? A republic conceives the state as the people's thing, right? It depends who are the people, and we're not going to get into that. It leads to a lot of issues as well. But then the question becomes, what role does the people play in making law? And Republicans argue that the people should be in a position to legislate, to make laws to which they are then subject. So they're the makers of their own laws. They are therefore autonomous. Auto, self, nomos, legislating, or concerning the law. So in that sense, yes, it was the practical realization of this kind of Enlightenment-inspired, say, Republican thinking that continues to inspire Republicans today. I say lowercase Republican.
Yeah, not Republican like
not
party.
the Republican Party.
Yeah.
But there's a lot that has been published, especially in contemporary political philosophy, that is inspired by this neo-Romanist conception of republicanism, which is all about non-domination, not being subject to the arbitrary will of another individual. And in many respects, that's what the French Revolution tried to achieve. Whether or not it successfully achieved that is a different story. But there are now attempts to kind of turn the clock back and to say that this is not worth achieving or protecting. And those who are committed to republicanism, lowercase r again, or to liberal democracy for that matter, should be concerned.
Where would you say that pushback is coming from? What does that look like?
So the push, and this is also a complicated question, but in many respects, the pushback is coming from, you could think of it in terms of fundamental assumptions of liberalism, and those are under attack. What do I mean by that? That the individual should be at the epicenter rather than the police. That the individual should be in a position to decide rather than the state what is the best course of life. Sometimes that's referred to as the atomistic individual, separated from the rest of the political community. That leads to a very impoverished way of looking at human life in the modern world. And because of that, there's a yearning to return to a different orientation where we have shared values that are very thick rather than thin. And we talked about religion being a very kind of powerful glue that brings people together. Well, sometimes religion, when it is politicized, can also be a problematic glue, right, that sets people apart if you're not part of this or that denomination, because you don't share the absolute truth, if you will, that is propagated by this or that view of theological doctrines, if I can put it in that. So it's coming in large part as a response to liberalism and the extent to which liberalism prioritizes the individual, their rights, for their sense of identity. And there is a backlash against that because some people are of the view that that is a very impoverished way of looking at human life and of politics more specifically. And of course, there are many different factors which would take us far afield, but I think it's a response to liberalism by its critics. Right? And there are differences between liberalism and republicanism. But the basic sense here is that in liberalism, the individual is sacred. The rights of the individual, the kind of the sphere of their liberty, should be protected against that of the community of which they are a part. And even if the individual engages in unethical practices, provided that those are not illegal, the individual is ultimately the final arbiter. The state should not impose particular theological doctrine or a comprehensive conception of the good life. The claim is that the individual knows best. Now, not everyone shares that view, and in many respects, some are revolting against it, and it also has to do with political economic issues, great inequality and economic dislocation. People feel alienated, and liberalism for some doesn't provide that horizon for political reflection that it used to.
Yeah,
It's a long-winded answer to your query.
It's a great answer, though. I think that it's an intricate balance between, that atomized individual who, lives for themselves but isn't really connected. I think that's bad. But at the same time, is the alternative taking rights away? Of course not. We talked about reason earlier, and, each of us have differing capability of exercising our reason, which leaves some people, as well as of course socioeconomic factors and globalization and the whole world is kind of on fire right now. So I would say
Literally and
yes. So I would say that having issues with the individual in a society is you would expect that. So I think it's interesting trying to balance that. How much autonomy should a person have versus their ability to exercise the autonomy when everything's supposed to be blank slate. But we've been talking now about revolution and about change and about growth. So let's talk about latent wisdom. I'd like to talk about history. So how would you say that ideas and philosophies from the past play a role in today's, increasingly liberal society?
Well, first we have to start with the presupposition that human beings do not live in a blank slate, that we cannot start from scratch, that we inherit the contradictions and the legacies of the past. Now, latent wisdom, the overarching Burkean, if I may add here, and then Burke's kind of teaching is that it's something that's positive and that ought to be preserved. Not everyone shares that view. So the idea of latent wisdom is that it's there, right, and that there's something to be learned from it, from harnessing that wisdom. Some traditions are not worth preserving, right? Slavery would be a case in point. You could argue, I'm sure the argument has been made that maybe it should be brought back. And of course, it's not an argument that I would support in any way or form. But one thing to note is that human beings do not live in a vacuum, do not live in a blank slate, and that we, and we're talking about, Western liberal democracies here, inherit all of the legacies of that particular historical developments and series of developments, including the wars, including colonialism, including imperialism. Right? That's part of the liberal democratic empire. That's part and parcel of the liberal democratic tradition. And I think we have to kind of look frankly at that and then ask ourselves which aspects of this tradition are worth preserving, because they still speak to the challenges of our time. And one thing that I often like to emphasize is, of course, common law of precedent. What is precedent if not an attempt to come to grips with previous decisions in the form of latent wisdom that we continue to think about many years after the people who made those decisions are no longer around? I'm talking about judges and the common law. But even here, the source of the wisdom and how that wisdom is interpreted will vary from time to time. So even if we talk about stare decisis, even if we talk about common law precedent, it's not like the same judgment is literally copied and pasted in subsequent iterations, because otherwise there would be no developments in the law. So even if one were to be a solid Burkean, the point of conservation is precisely to allow for change. The bad kind of conservation is the kind that is oblivious to the fact that society is changing. The best kind of conservation, even according to Burke, is to conserve in order to preserve something that's worth preserving as society changed. His view, of course, was that the idea of a radical break with the past, which precisely the French Revolution sought to achieve, was a nightmare because it is predicated on the view that you could start from scratch. Now, there is no wisdom to preserve. And I think the key here is to understand that even when you are conserving, you're conserving those aspects that you deem valuable. You don't just conserve in the literal sense of the word. You think of precedent. You refer back to previous judgments in order to try to figure out how those previous judgments still speak to the challenges that you're encountering. Because law is all about challenges. Challenges that spring up precisely because there are changes in society. Changes about core values. So that would be my way of thinking about latent wisdom. It comes from the need for us to navigate in this complex modern world, having to figure out which aspects of this world are worth preserving and developing, and which aspects are worth chucking, as it were, to the dustbin of human history. And I think if we are to be charitable to birth, it's not an attempt to conserve everything, it's to conserve the things that work for us, right? And the us part is, of course, understood in an inclusive fashion. But that, the us itself is being debated, let alone the discussion of what's worth preserving and what's worth chucking to the dustbin of history.
And so, talking about the dustbin of history, one of the first things I'm reading in university is Francis Fukuyama's End of History, and it's essentially a discussion that in the late 20th century, all of the competing ideologies had died out, and liberalism was the last one standing. However, we've seen a rise in populism, and we can see that we're in a time politically where things are polarized and contentious. In your view, is history over, or would you say that we're encountering something new?
Yeah, well, we have to situate that work. So, what was assigned in case my class, you probably read it, encountered it earlier, Francis Fukuyama's The End of History. So, there's an essay and there's an entire book. And we have to keep in mind that Francis Fukuyama wrote that work in a very historically specific period, which you described in passing, namely the collapse or the near collapse at the time that he was writing of Soviet-style socialism. It's sometimes referred to as state socialism or actually existing socialism. And this kind of aura of liberal triumphalism that actually there is no serious competing ideological counterforce to liberal democratic capitalism anywhere in the world. And that there may still be disagreements between states. Nationalism may still pose a threat. Religious fundamentalism may still pose a threat to this. But generally speaking, there is no credible authority that people will be ideological, to be clear, that people would be willing to fight for, to die for, and worse, to kill for, with the ascendance of a liberal democracy as kind of the final universalizing ideology globally. And of course, Francis Fukuyama has returned to this issue. It's been much criticized, but of course it was, whether you like Francis Fukuyama's thesis or not, it really made a dent at the time. And my reasoning is it made a dent at the time precisely because it caught the spirit of the time, the zeitgeist, if you will, with the collapse of state socialism that followed the Berlin Wall. It seemed at the time to many liberal capitalists, if you will, opponents of liberal capitalism, that there really is no other way. In fact, that was encapsulated by Margaret Thatcher's adage that there is no alternative. Right? And so, in many respects, I think that really helped popularize this view. And nowadays, it's more or less used as a foil to say, look at how wrong he was. And in fact, to his credit, he's returned to this question. And now more than ever, he seems to think that liberalism needs to defend itself in ways that it didn't need to defend itself after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So you have a lot of defensive liberals, like Francis Fukuyama, basically giving up on some of that triumphalism in the face of liberalism's challenges, saying, actually, this is precisely why liberalism needs to defend itself against its challengers on the right, particularly, and to some extent, what's left of them, according to Fukuyama on the left. And he has a book, Liberalism and Its Discontents, I believe. That's the title, where he tries to address these issues. And I'll leave it for your listeners, for viewers, to make an informed opinion of their own. But again, the point is there is a noticeable change in the tenet of Fukuyama's reflections, that he doesn't think that liberals can be as triumphalist as they once were. And that means that liberalism itself is increasingly under attack, something that was perhaps unimaginable for Fukuyama when he had written that particular work.
And I think that that's something that's even seems unimaginable to people today. I mean, as much as there is a rise in nationalism and again populism, like I had said earlier, I don't think anybody's out there arguing for their opposition to lose their inherent rights or for them to lose those. Perhaps you may disagree, but I think for the most part, discourse still seems civil. So I would personally believe liberals in contact. But I hear that there are certainly discontents.
Yes, but the nature of the discontents, I think, is different. So in some cases, some refer to the rise of the far right and the resurgence of fascism, actually, where the goal isn't simply to work within the constraints of liberal democracy, but rather to undermine the very institutions of liberal democracy. So what you call an inherent right wouldn't be a right at all. Remember how I mentioned that this is partly in response to liberal, atomistic liberalism, but also capitalism in particular. But that people don't feel, some people, that it provides a sense of meaning, purpose, let alone livelihood for the precarious workers who feel left, abandoned, right, in the globalized, financialized capitalist world. And that leads some of them, not all of them, to be sure, to support parties and movements that may pose a threat to the foundations of liberal democracy. And so, in many respects, as I said before, there are different factors that contribute to the resurgence of not only populism, and populism takes on different forms. It's not inherently a bad thing, because think about populism itself has something to do with the people. It's not a minoritarian or elitist position. But sometimes it can be construed in that fashion as actually a basis for exclusion of those that don't get included as the people. And that becomes very dangerous indeed. So my point here is that if one wishes to vindicate liberal values, that one shouldn't take or assume a carefree attitude about liberalism's challenges. And so one has to think very carefully about what needs to be in place for liberalism to revive itself in the context of the 21st century. And I think, the evidence is that people like Fukuyama no longer have that carefree attitude. They can't conclude that. My view is that history never ended, nor was it anywhere close to ending. I think it's a very dangerous and a very arrogant position to take. But that's just my view. But I think even Fukuyama today isn't particularly gung-ho about the idea that history has come to an end. He still seems to be of the view that there aren't, really credible challenges to liberalism taking its place, liberal capitalism, I should add. But he's a lot more worried and concerned than he once was.
So I would love to switch gears and play a more fun philosophical game. I'll ask some fairly simple questions that offer broad interpretations, and I'd love to get your response and maybe share my thoughts. And you at home, if you feel so interested, feel free to leave in the comments your answer. First question. If you could have dinner with any philosopher from history, who would it be and what would you ask?
I think it will most likely be Friedrich Nietzsche, in large part because Nietzsche is one of these bombastic philosophers who said a lot of outrageous things, and some of them were very interesting indeed. And he gets, our blood boiling by some of the provocative things that he has said. And it would have just been an interesting experience to kind of push him on some of his philosophical points of view, precisely because they question a lot of the things that contemporaries take for granted, like equality, as I said before, in terms of rights, in terms of opportunities, but also the kind of creature comforts, as he would put it, that most of us, take for granted and wouldn't want to lose. And so, what I would want to ask him is that I would want to ask him the question of whether or not he would have been surprised by some of the people who appropriated his philosophy. I mean, Nietzsche doesn't have a systematic philosophy. I mean, he says things that often contradict other things that he says in his work. But it would have been interesting to ask him what he would say about how his philosophy was appropriated, and it seems to be appropriated, in fact, by the far right in some instances. And I think the same question could be posed to someone like Karl Marx. What would he make of the appropriation of his philosophy for political purposes in the 20th century? But with Nietzsche, I find that, given all the scandalous and provocative things that he says, he would be an especially suitable candidate for these kinds of questions. And in any case, it'd be fun to fight it out with him.
I can imagine.
I have a soft spot for Nietzsche, notwithstanding a lot of other problems I have with his political philosophical views.
I would say that is a meal I would pay to watch someone else have. For
Yeah.
sure, that conversation.
Yeah. Me too.
Yeah.
Maybe I would pay for the meal.
Fair, yeah. I think I keep getting stuck between two thinkers that you wouldn't think would clash, but I would either speak with Wollstonecraft or with Machiavelli. With Wollstonecraft, I think I really want to ask, where did you get the courage to do this? For those of you unfamiliar, this is the mother of feminism. This is the person who one of the founders. Google likes to proclaim the one. I would just ask, how did you take the courage to really step out of that box? And especially, I think one of the most important things about that book, about her writings, are just that it's not just men subjugating women, and it's not just women, but it's like an entire societal view that everyone needs to change, and everybody needs to pursue reason and education
and
virtue, regardless of sex. And I think, especially for what the mid 1800s, that's a pretty exciting and intense view. Or I would ask Machiavelli, and perhaps I'm not as nice a person as I thought I was, but I'd ask him, what happened? How did you not? You wrote this book that, in my opinion, is one of the gold standards for leadership, for attaining power, and you can talk about the moral aspects of that, but it's undeniable the importance of the book. I'd ask him, where's your resume? I guess maybe that's not as well thought out of an answer as I could give, but this man, I feel, could have achieved more, at least looking at his political career 500 years in the future. Seems as though there's more room for growth, I guess, if he had employed his tactic.
Mm-hmm.
In an alternate universe where you weren't a professor, what profession would you choose based on philosophical alignment?
I don't think my reasoning would be informed by philosophical alignment unless it's hedonism. And what is hedonism if not the focal point being the maximization of pleasure in the higher sense of the word? But personally, I've always enjoyed playing soccer or football, and competitively for fun as well. And, this is something I would have loved to do, notwithstanding all the risks associated with it, injuries and so on and so forth. But just as we have a certain love of wisdom, right, especially in political philosophy, thinking about the questions that we think about and trying to come up with answers to those very challenging questions. So I have the same kind of drive when it comes, I used to anyway, when it comes to playing soccer and football, which I still think is, and this is going to be a provocative point, is the world's most beautiful game.
Soccer.
Yes. Or football, as it's called elsewhere.
Interesting. Lots of collaboration, lots of movement.
Yeah. Yes, and there's a goal.
Fair enough.
Sense of purpose.
I guess you don't get a lot of them in each game, so it makes each of them more valuable, I suppose.
It depends on the game.
Yeah. Interesting. I would say, for a question like that, I can't really proclaim to have a profession yet.
Mm-hmm.
But I think when it comes to philosophical alignment, the concept of having a bunch of little children running around, being a full-time father, when it comes to interest, I think that would probably be up there for certain. If you could create a social contract for a utopian society, what non-negotiable rule would you include?
Mm-hmm. A very good question. Hypothetical, society. I don't think, maybe I would think of it along the lines of a social contract. Maybe that'd be the first point. But to answer your question, in a serious manner, I think, one, the right to think differently, and two, the right to participate in collective decision-making, which I think should never be undermined.
Interesting. I went a little bit more of a lighter route. You must take your cart back when shopping. You can't leave the shopping cart, firstly.
There are too many assumptions.
Fair enough. Secondly, no pajama pants in the gym. Those are my two big rules. If we're going to set up a utopian society, you cannot wear pajama pants in the gym. You have to take your shopping cart back. Sillier than your answer.
It's good to know where your priorities are currently.
I don't appreciate those two things.
Understood.
What do you think, when looking for a leader, is the most important thing?
I mean, that's a very difficult question. I think there has to be some sense of charisma, but charisma is one of those things that can be used for positive goals and purposes, and can also be abused, and I'm going to get into that. But I think leader or leadership, if I can put it in those terms, because it's not confined simply to politics. is someone who is attentive and receptive to people's lived experiences, challenges, and potential. And I think someone who is able to be attentive, to listen to these lived experiences and realities is, a good candidate and equipped with leadership skills. I think being inattentive to the lived realities of ordinary individuals puts them at loggerheads with ordinary people, their wishes, their desires. And I think a leader has to be attentive, especially attentive to the lived realities, challenges, and opportunities facing ordinary people.
Yeah, a leader without their finger on the pulse doesn't know where to go next, I suppose.
And then you have to figure out what the pulse is, right? Which isn't always easy to do. And I think in a way, it brings us back to Machiavelli, right? And Machiavelli also talks about certain opportunities or fortuna, which he interprets very violently. Won't go into that. But that the leader also is able to recognize opportunities where he can, or she can, or they can align with certain circumstances, forms of oppression facing ordinary people, and help get the people organized, thinking about and participating in politics. So they feel like they have a stake in it, right? To change the world, for the better. And people can't do that if they're not organized. And it's really hard to do that in the absence of leadership. Notice I say the absence of leadership because I don't think it's confined to any individual leader. Because if we're committed to democracy, as I am, we also have to be receptive to the view that the individuals, when they come together, when they're organized, are often wiser or more wise than the few. This, ironically, is also a quote, you could say, a near quote from Aristotle. Sometimes when the people get together, and if they exercise leadership, they can actually be more wise than the few who claim to be more wise than the rabble of unintelligent people. Leadership can help ignite that sense of organization. The people can call their own shots. I think that's really important for democracy, which is under attack.
Yeah, I would agree completely. I think just the other day I had an episode with Professor Mark McIsaac, and he's a leadership professor over in the business school. And he said leadership is negotiating, is the space between people. And it's negotiating a vision and an idea that, people will gravitate towards and you can work together. And so that definitely charisma feels like the right way to put that, for sure. And lastly, if happiness was a national currency, what kind of work would make you rich?
Well, I think teaching. I know maybe it's a bit cliche, but I really believe that because you're using hedonic presuppositions having to do with pleasure or satisfaction.
Sex work is off the table.
Okay, we'll go into that.
Off the table.
But in terms of what would make me happy, it would be to teach in large part because the best kind of experience one has as a teacher is to see students, what you're learning, what you're studying together, resonating with the students, right? You sort of feel those sparks fly. And sometimes the best feeling is when you learn from your students, right? I think it doesn't get better than that. And that has happened to me and continues to happen to me all the time. I wouldn't give that up for anything, and especially if happiness is the prevailing currency. But then I think, teaching continues to give its many great dividends.
Yeah, that's that more or less is what I was thinking as well. The ability to see someone grow, and know that it is you contributing, not from like I am the best sort of way, but understanding that you were able to make a positive contribution in another person's life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and see, I would, again, not that I am a parent, but I would view that from a parent, parent's eye. It's that thought of raising that family. But I want to thank you very much for coming on with the pod. Is there anything you'd like to say to the people before we
To the people?
to the people? Yeah.
Yeah, I feel these great stakes talking to the people. But I just want to return to one point that you made earlier, that thinkers like Mary Wollstonecraft, the reason why we write, think, and continue to read the works of thinkers like Wollstonecraft is precisely because they challenged the prevailing assumptions of their time. And in many respects, as I try to point out in the class, that these great thinkers are engaged in what's called a transhistorical dialogue, right? That's not simply limited to their time, right? And so, in many respects, right, I think the challenge of our time is also to think outside of the box, not simply to agree or to consume all the things that are thrown at us, but to think critically about what we're learning, about what we're reading, right? In order to think about how we can become better citizens by becoming more informed citizens, right? By learning how to think for ourselves, right? And I think political philosophy and philosophy more generally gives us the resources, preliminary resources, to get there. And I think this is a time when the social science and humanities are under attack for a whole host of different reasons, and I think we have to revalue them. We have to explain the extent to which these are really priceless when it comes to, getting people to think for themselves, not to be taken advantage by others who claim to know better than they do what is in their own interest. And you can't think for yourself if you don't have the courage to read for yourself, right? And to think above all outside the box. And the humanities and the social sciences help equip students and ideally future citizens of liberal democratic societies to exercise their critical thinking skills. We need that more than ever. So that's kind of my final, confession, if you will. We have to revalue the humanities and the social sciences precisely in the spirit of the Enlightenment, so that people can think for themselves and can arrive at informed conclusions about the state of the world as it is, and also about the world that they'd like to see.
Sentiments I agree with entirely. Thank you very much for coming on.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening, everybody. Have a great day.